Welcome, everybody. Great to virtually see some of you, and very excited for this talk. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sinan Aral. I'm the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy and have been around this center for going on 20 years as a student and now as director. So in continuation of our fantastic lunch series, I'm really pumped for this one today to have David Rand, who's the Edwin Shell Professor at the Sloan School and in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT. We were really pleased, lucky, to be able to convince Dave to join us from Yale a couple of years back, which was probably one of the best decisions that we made in a long time. As some of you know or may know, we have done some large-scale work on misinformation that was published, for instance, in Science Magazine, on the cover of Science Magazine in 2018. Since that time, it is no exaggeration to say that Dave and his colleagues have been at the forefront doing the most interesting and the most important work on misinformation that I have read. He has produced a number of blockbuster papers in just in a few short years on many different relevant topics to this topic stream. That get at why we believe in shared misinformation and what we can do to stop it. It really is just a fantastic body of work. So I'm really, really excited to have him summarize and speak to us about this body of work, a number of different papers at the same time. I'm positive that it's going to be amazingly illuminating. I want to remind you that all questions should come through chat, and that we prefer if you turn your video cameras off during the presentation so that we can focus on Dave. And so without further ado, I give you Dave Rand. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for that really nice introduction. And I'm excited to tell you all about some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years around this question of misinformation. And in particular, what I'm going to focus on is trying to understand what we can do to fight misinformation, in particular misinformation on social media. And before I dig into that question, I just want to start with some definitions, because lots of people use similar words in different ways. I'm going to talk about fake news or false news, and by that I don't mean anything that I disagree with, which is some people's common usage of that, but instead we're talking specifically about entirely fabricated stories presented as if they're actual, factual, legitimate news. And this kind of blatant misinformation is what's gotten the lion's shares of attention in the last few years. And we think it's important, but we're also interested in what I'll call hyperpartisan news, which is biased or misleading interpretation of things that did actually happen. So not blatantly false, but very misleading. And I think this has gotten a lot less attention, but it's probably much more pervasive and probably more important. And so we're sort of interested in tackling both of these challenges. Now, the current sort of state of the art, if you're a social media platform, is fundamentally they're tech companies, and their basics idea about how to solve the misinformation problem is a tech solution, which is just use machine learning, make a good fake news classifier, and then your job is done. You'll just know what all the fake news is, and you can demote it or label it or whatever. But it's an extremely hard problem. As we've seen, they're still very much not on top of it. And this is because, I mean, there are a variety of reasons, but one of them is, truth is not a super cut and dried, simple concept. And so it's hard to create good training sets. And also there's major non-stationarity problems because the characteristics of misinformation change over time. The COVID-19 pandemic is a great example of this, where all of a sudden there was this whole new class of misinformation that hadn't been around before, and I think that the classifiers were not ready for it. So while this is an important part of the toolkit, it's very much not a complete solution. The other thing that platforms have been doing a lot is bringing humans into the loop in the form of professional fact checkers. So partnering with sites like Snopes.com or factcheck.org, where we have professional fact checkers who do research on potentially problematic seeming articles and then, or news stories, and then decide whether they're true or false. And if they say they're false, then the platforms might put a warning label on it or might demote the content. And I think that this is actually, in general helpful, but the problem is there's just a massive scalability problem, which is it takes, a long time to fact check articles, and it takes essentially zero time to manufacture false content. And so that the fact checkers can't possibly keep up. And so what we're interested in doing, what I'm going to talk about in this talk, is research that we've been doing that tries to sort of use the lens of cognitive science to develop some interventions that can be added to the toolkit that are scalable. And the way that we do this is we start by just asking the basic question of why is it that people share misinformation in the first place? And then from there, we'll see what can we do about it. I think the simplest possible explanation for why people share misinformation is that they're just confused. They're doing their best to only share true content, but they just can't tell what's true or what's not. And so they wind up sharing inaccurate content. And as one way to test the extent to which confusion can entirely explain the misinformation sharing problem, we ran a bunch of experiments, one of which I'll tell you about here. We recruited about 1,000 Americans represented on age, gender, ethnicity, and geographic region. Oh, actually, sorry, in this one, they were not represented. So 1,000 Americans from Amazon Mechanical Turk. We showed them a set of news headlines in Facebook format, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And we randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. In the accuracy condition, we showed them the headline here in sort of Facebook format. And we asked, to the best of your knowledge, is the claim in this headline accurate? So this will let us tell how confused they are about truth versus falsehood. And then in the sharing condition, people saw the same set of headlines, but instead of getting asked about accuracy, we asked, would you consider sharing the story online, for example, through Facebook or Twitter? And so now what we're going to look at is the fraction of headlines people either said were accurate or that they would share as a function of whether the headlines are false or true, and whether the headlines align with their ideology or not. And so starting with accuracy, what we see is that actually people are quite discerning. So for this set of headlines, the true headlines were rated as much more accurate than the false headlines, regardless of whether they aligned with the participants' ideology or not. And ideological alignment only had a fairly modest impact on accuracy judgments. So when it comes to telling truth from falsehood, they're doing pretty well. And so if what was driving misinformation sharing was just confusion, then the pattern over here should look pretty similar. But as you can see, it really doesn't. The actual veracity of the article had almost no impact on whether people would share it or not. And instead, the partisan alignment had a big impact. And so there's this striking disconnect between accuracy judgments and sharing that's particularly brought to the fore by looking at headlines that are false but aligned with the participants' ideology. They're twice as likely to say they would share such headlines as they are to rate those headlines as accurate. And so that suggests that there's a good chunk of misinformation sharing that's not just about confusion. The question is then, okay, well, if it's not confusion, then what is it? Why are people sharing this content? And what might be a natural explanation to a lot of you, because it's a pretty dominant narrative in both the academy and the sort of mainstream discussion of this stuff, is that we're now in a post-truth world where people just don't care about accuracy very much anymore, and they care more about things like partisanship. And so they choose to share things that they think aren't true just because they want those narratives to be out there. And so as a preliminary way to get a little bit of insight into whether people are at least explicitly post-truth, we did a survey experiment where we asked people, when deciding whether to share a piece of content on social media, how important is it to you that that content is surprising, aligned with your politics, funny, interesting, or accurate? the dark purple is the fraction of people that said that is basically the darker it is, the more important they're saying that dimension is. And so what you see is that people overwhelmingly said that they thought it was either very extremely important to share content based on accuracy. And the vast majority of people said accuracy was as important or more important than any other dimension. So at least explicitly, people are not endorsing a post-truth, well, accuracy doesn't matter anymore kind of mindset. Of course, this is just self-report, and so people might be lying, but we'll sort of dig into this in more detail a little bit later. But what we're going to propose is it's not so much that people in general are purposely sharing misinformation, but instead, we think the problem is that people are just distracted. So people have this preference, they don't want to share inaccurate information, but they also have a lot of other preferences. And when you're on social media, your attention is drawn away from accuracy and towards all of these other things that you're getting direct feedback on. Like, you get direct social validation and reinforcement feedback, how much people liked it, what are people thinking of you, things like that. And so we think that the social media context focuses your attention on all of these largely social factors and away from accuracy. And so if it's true that the problem is one of attention rather than one about basic preferences, then if you just get people to consider accuracy, to think about whether something's accurate or not, that will lead them to be more discerning in their sharing, because they would be able to identify what's true or false reasonably well, and they would not want to share things if they realized that the content was inaccurate. So as an initial test of this prediction, we ran another survey experiment where we randomly assigned participants to a control or a treatment. Again, they saw a set of headlines, half true, half false, half sort of right-leaning, half left-leaning. And in the control, we just asked them for each headline, if you were to see this article on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? And replicating what I showed you before, we found no meaningful difference in the sharing probability of true versus false headlines. So they were not discerning in their sharing. And then the treatment was exactly the same, but on every item, before asking whether they would share it, we asked whether they thought the claim was accurate or not. So basically, we're forcing them to consider accuracy before they indicate their sharing preference. And so what we see is that this cuts the sharing of false articles in half, which also lines up with what I mentioned before about the sharing of false, sort of ideologically aligned articles being twice as likely as the accuracy judgments. So what this suggests is just getting people to, forcing people to think about accuracy. If it reduces the misinformation sharing by half, then you can say that about half of this sort of baseline sharing of false content was due to inattention. Now, because we asked people in the treatment whether they thought the headlines were accurate or not, we can also decompose this sharing into how much of it was confusion, where people thought the headline was thought the headline was true, and that's why they shared it, versus purposeful sharing of false content, where they said it was false, and then they said they would share it. And so in blue is the fraction of these headlines in the treatment that people rated as accurate and said they would share. And these are the ones that they rated as inaccurate and said they would share. And so what you see is it's mostly people being confused. You could say about a third of this overall sharing of false content was due to confusion, and only a sixth of it was due to sort of post-truth purposeful sharing of false content. And so this suggests that if you could get people to think about accuracy, it would lead them to be a lot more discerning in their sharing. Now, if you want to think about actual applications, there's no way that Facebook is going to ask people, is this content accurate on every single post that they see? And so what we wanted to know is, are there ways that you can just nudge people to think about accuracy in a much sort of lighter touch way? And so we ran a bunch of other experiments testing ways of just sort of priming the concept of accuracy rather than forcing them to think through it. So for example, in some studies, at the beginning of the experiment, we say, before you start the real study, we want to pre-test some items for another study. Here's a random headline. How accurate do you think it is? Then they go on to the main study where they indicate their sharing intentions. But because they rated the accuracy of this one headline, the concept of accuracy is more top of mind. And so they're more likely to take accuracy into account in their subsequent sharing. Similarly, you can show sort of minimal digital literacy tips like be skeptical of headlines, investigate the source. We think that this doesn't actually teach anybody anything. These are, not, it's not that people have never heard of these ideas before, but just seeing the tips activates the concept of accuracy. Similarly, you can do a survey where you ask the participant themselves, how important is it to you that you only share articles if they're accurate? Most people will respond, very important or extremely important. And the idea is just taking the survey makes them think about accuracy. So then when they go back to their feed afterwards, they're more inclined to be thinking about accuracy and therefore to be more discerning in your sharing. And this is even more effective if you pair it with some information about the fact that other people also really care about accuracy. And so across a lot of survey experiments with over 10,000 participants, we find that all of these different ways of nudging people to think about accuracy makes them more discerning in their sharing. So it increases the difference between true and false headline sharing. It works equally well for headlines that align with your ideology versus headlines that don't. And if anything, it actually works better on ideologically aligned headlines. It also works for COVID-19 related news. It works for Democrats as well as Republicans. And although most of our work has focused on the United States, we've also replicated these results in Italy, France, Canada, and China so far. And we're about to undertake a big cross-cultural study doing this in like a dozen countries. So together, this is a bunch of evidence from survey experiments suggesting that nudging people to think about accuracy, or sort of prompting them to consider the concept of accuracy in general, can make them more discerning in their sharing intentions. But so far, everything that I've talked about has been survey experiments with this sort of sharing intentions rather than looking at actual sharing. And there's reason to think that the sharing intentions results should generalize to real sharing. We have work showing that the self-report self-report sharing intentions are actually correlated with real sharing, but we really wanted to know. So what we did is we ran a field experiment in which we sent messages similar to the treatments that we used in the survey experiments to users on Twitter and saw what impact it had on their subsequent sharing. So in order to do this, we created an army of bot accounts. We wanted to sort of vaguely simulate what it would be like if the platforms themselves implemented this. So we used accounts that were explicitly bots, and we also used a sort of neutral label, so not something about news or accuracy, which used a sort of cooking bot. So we had our army of cooking bots, and using these accounts, we followed over 130,000 Twitter users who had recently retweeted a link to a Breitbart article, which is a sort of hyper-partisan right-leaning site that often shares misinformation. Of those 130-odd thousand people, about 11,000 of them followed our accounts back. So now those people are followers of our accounts. We can send direct messages to them, and they sort of form our subject pool. And out of that 11,000, we restricted to about 5,000 subjects who we were reasonably confident were not bots themselves, and who had shared some news, in the previous week or two. And so for this set of 5,000 odd subjects, what we did is we had one of our accounts, whichever one they were following them, send them a private direct message that says, how accurate is this headline? We show, again, some sort of random non-partisan headline, say, hey, thanks for following me. Can I ask you for a favor? I'm wondering how accurate the headline is, and I'm doing a survey to find out. Almost nobody responds to the message, but that's totally fine. We don't need them to respond. All we need them to do is just sort of read the top sentence, and they've effectively been treated in that the concept of accuracy has been activated in their mind. And so now we want to know what's the consequence of reading this message on their subsequent sharing. And so in order to do causal inference, we used a stepped wedge design where everyone, like all 5,000 odd users, receive the treatment. And what we randomly vary is the day on which people receive the treatment. And so like the first group of people get the message on day 1, the second group on day 2, the third group on day 3, and so on. And so then the way this works is on the day that you receive the treatment, we look at what you do for the next 24 hours, and we consider that the sort of treatment data. And then we can compare that to all of the people from the same day who haven't yet received the message, and so they form the control. And so it's sort of like each day that has both treatment data and control data is like its own mini experiment. You throw out the data from the last day because there's no control. And so then you can compare the quality of the links shared in the treatment windows compared to the control people. And now, in order to measure quality, the approach that we used is, it's not possible to individually rank all of the millions of tweets that are involved in the experiment. And so we do source level or sort of publisher level ratings. And what we did is we have this set of 60 news sources, 20 mainstream news sources, 20 hyperpartisan news sources, and 20 fake news sources. And we had 8 professional fact checkers rate the trustworthiness of each of these sites. As you can see here, the mainstream ones are in green. So like New York Times, Washington Post get very high trust ratings. Fox News is like not doing so great, and Daily Mail, New York Post are sort of down here. But they're still getting better ratings than the misinformation, the hyperpartisan sites in orange, things like Breitbart on the right or Daily Kos on the left, and then the just extreme fake news sites that you've never heard of, and that are just getting terrible ratings. And so basically we want to know, if we look at all the links that the people share, how is the quality of those news sources affected by receiving the treatment? And an important part of this experiment is we wanted to make sure that if we tested this, that we were testing it on people who at baseline were actually sharing a lot of misinformation. We're not interested in improving the sharing behavior of people that already are quite discerning in their sharing. And we were successful in doing that, in that I've set the sort of y-axis intercept here, that is this horizontal line, represents the average quality of links shared pre-treatment amongst our 5,000 odd subjects. So these are not people that once randomly shared a Breitbart article, but these are people who are on average worse than the worst mainstream site in our data set. And so now I want to say, okay, what's the impact? And because the Twitter data is a lot more complicated than survey experiments, there's many different choices that you might make about how to analyze the data. Like there's lots of different model specifications and ways to deal with some randomization failure, and do you include opinion pieces or not? And there's many different choices like that. And so the approach that we take in the paper is we consider 192 different analytic approaches, and then we look at the distribution of p-values across these different approaches. And what you see is that in over 80% of the analytic approaches, you get a significant result, and it's sort of skewed towards 0. And so this is sort of indicative of a robust effect that is not particular to 1 or 2 analytic specifications. And so to give a sense of what the effect looks like, I'm going to show you the change in relative tweet frequency to the various different outlets as a function of how much the fact checkers trust each outlet. So if you see positive values, that means receiving the message increased the fraction of tweets to that outlet. If you see a negative y-axis value, that means receiving the message decreased the fraction of tweets sent to that publisher. And the size of the dot is going to be proportional to the number of tweets made to the given source pre-treatment. And so what you see is there's this strong positive relationship where these people, even though they were selected for having previously shared Breitbart, getting this accuracy reminder significantly decreases the fraction of their tweets that include links to Breitbart or Daily Caller, which is another sort of major hyperpartisan right site, and increases the share of their tweets to mainstream outlets like New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, and also Fox News. And FoxNews.com is, in general, much more accurate than Fox News talking heads shows or opinion shows. So I think overall, this is a meaningful increase in the quality of the news sources that people are sharing. Among the users that tweeted, this translates into a 5%, on a treatment day, this translates into a 5% increase in the average tweet quality, and it more than triples the level of discernment. That is the difference in number of links to mainstream sites versus hyperpartisan or fake news sites. Importantly, remember our sort of account for this whole thing is that the problem for a lot of people around misinformation is one of attention. And so if what this sort of accuracy nudge message is doing is getting people to pay attention more to accuracy, then we would expect to have it primarily show up in the context of retweets, not primary tweets, because retweets are the context where you're attention constrained, you're scrolling quickly, you're just kind of clicking, should I tweet it, should I not tweet it, whatever. Whereas when you're composing a primary tweet, then you're much more like really paying attention. And so the sort of attentional constraint is mostly in retweets, and so we'd only expect the treatment to work on retweets, and indeed that's what we find. There's a substantial effect on retweets, and there's no effect on primary tweets. And one other thing that's important is that we find that the treatment works equally well, and if anything, slightly better for users that have more followers relative to users that have fewer followers. And so that suggests that if you could get large, users with lots of followers to be a bit more discerning in their sharing, then via network effects, that could really have a substantial impact on the propagation of misinformation. And in the paper, we do some simulation, some network simulations showing how the network effects could potentially amplify the treatment effect, really quite substantially. And so what this translates into basically is a class of intervention that platforms could really easily implement, where, say, while you're scrolling through your news feed, every once in a while you get a pop-up or you get a card in feed that says, help us inform our algorithms, how accurate is this headline, same thing, and they can click accurate or inaccurate. And the idea is, even if you throw away the responses, just asking the question will be impactful by getting people to be more likely to think about accuracy and therefore more discerning in their subsequent sharing. And so what I like a lot about this approach is that it's distributed in the sense that it doesn't rely on some centralized authority being at the platform or the fact checkers or something like that, certifying what's true and what's not true. And instead, it takes advantage of people's own ability and inclination to identify and not share accurate content if they bother to stop and think about it. And so this also means that it is extremely scalable because it's just having sort of each person do their own internal monitoring. What we've done so far, we think of as sort of proof of concept that this can work. What we would hope is that tech companies would take this seriously and then use their resources and access to on-platform experiments, at massive scale to really optimize the treatment, figure out how to do it most effectively, how to do it in a sustainable way, things like that. Another important point is that this isn't only in the hands of tech companies. It's also something that civil society organizations or individual people could deploy themselves using ads. You can target people that you think are likely to be sharing misinformation with ads that basically just do the same thing. Say, how accurate do you think this headline is? How important is it to you to only share accurate content? Things like that. And our work suggests that that should also be effective. And an important part of implementing this is that you want to regularly change the format so that people don't just start ignoring it and tuning it out. But that's the kind of thing that platforms have tons of experience doing, because they're always trying to avoid this kind of banner blindness on a range of different banners. So we think that like this is something that could be easily deployed in a meaningful way by social media platforms. Okay, so the idea that I've been talking about so far are these nudges, which you may have noticed are extremely non-confrontational. It's not anything about like, oh, sorry, I see a question about essentially the sustainability of this, like how long before people start, like basically how long are people willing to respond to it versus ignoring it. I think that this is, as I was saying, this is clearly a sort of practical issue that needs to get resolved for this approach. And I think it's something that platforms, as I was saying, have lots of experience in terms of getting people to continue to engage with the stuff they want to engage with. And so I think a big part of that is not having it always be the same question, not doing it too regularly, and also taking advantage of their complete knowledge of the network graph to figure out what's sort of optimal targeting policies for breaking up the spread of information sort of within clusters, how you kind of make it so you minimize the frequency that any individual person receives a nudge while maximizing the sort of overall impact. And so like a key feature of this setup is we're not saying you did something wrong, like you shared misinformation, don't do it. And we're not doing anything normative like saying, hey, you should really be paying attention and quit messing up. But instead, it's just this totally kind of innocuous, like, oh, how accurate do you think this thing is? Sort of where we want your expertise to help us identify things. And so, what we were interested in, that is, we designed it that way because we expected there to be some potential for reactance, where people wouldn't like it if they were directly corrected, but we wanted to investigate this. So in some new work led by my former postdoc, Mohsen Mosla, who's a professor at Exeter now, we wanted to see what happens if we directly correct false posts. There's a lot of evidence that suggests from survey experiments that corrections typically work in terms of leading people to have more correct beliefs about the specific thing that they were corrected on, but there hasn't really been any investigation of what are the downstream consequences of getting corrected on people's subsequent sharing. And you could imagine that it goes either way. Like it could be that it's more effective than the accuracy nudges, because it really focuses their attention on accuracy, shows that they made a mistake, makes them feel like, oh shoot, I messed up or whatever. But it could also backfire in the sense of either making people mad or activating like a don't tread on me kind of preference, or just by shifting their attention to social factors like embarrassment and things like that. So, so we wanted to test this in this experiment, and what we did is we got around 1,500 users that had posted links to articles that had been debunked by Snopes, and using a same sort of stepped wedge experimental design over 15 days, we sent corrections to each user that basically said, hey, this probably isn't true. Here's a link to a Snopes article debunking it. And then again, we looked at what was the impact on what the people shared in the 24 hours afterwards as a function of getting corrected. And this is sort of obviously not including any direct replies to the correction. And so the way I'm going to visualize this is I'm going to show you the sort of distribution of quality scores for all the links shared before they received the treatment in green and after they received the treatment in red. And what we find is, in marked contrast to our accuracy nudges, getting corrected actually significantly decreases the quality of the content that people subsequently share when retweeting, and again has no significant effect, and if anything is directionally opposite effect on primary tweets. And we also find similar effects in terms of the correction increasing the partisan slant of sources shared, retweeted, and some evidence of increasing language toxicity, although that result was weaker. So this is really interesting to us in that it suggests that you have to be, you have to do the accuracy nudging in the right way. And if you do it in a way that's either too public or social or confrontational, it can wind up backfiring. And so that, sort of brings us back to this kind of give us your opinion type intervention rather than a sort of admonishing like, hey, you messed up kind of intervention. Now, what I said when I introduced this intervention before is, okay, sorry, question on the old backfire effect. So yeah, so there's there was this original concern about the backfire effect, which specifically meant if you get corrected, then it makes you dig in on the focal belief. That is, if you say there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and then we say no, actually there weren't, then that can actually make you believe that more by getting people to engage in motivated reasoning and come up with all the reasons that the thing they thought was right and so on. And that idea itself has gotten pretty thoroughly debunked, which is to say that in terms of the focal belief that is being corrected, corrections typically work. But I think that the idea here is that so you might have a more accurate belief about the specific thing that you were corrected. Like, in this case, we would expect that the correction would make them less likely to believe that the Ukrainians donated the most cash of any nationality to the Clinton Foundation. But the point is that the corrections also can have downstream effects. And in particular, because we find it only on retweets, our idea here is being publicly corrected, by another user makes you think about all of these social, it brings up social things like embarrassment, and so makes you pay attention to that and sort of distracts you from accuracy. And another good question in terms of the left or right, basically, does the partisanship of the user interact with the effect of being corrected? And that's a great question. We actually haven't run that analysis yet, but it's on our list of things to do. This is sort of hot off the press data. In this pool, it was about 70% Republicans and 30% Democrats that were getting corrected, but yeah, we need to check that. And we also varied the partisanship of the account delivering the correction. And we didn't find much of a difference, but we didn't really have I don't think we really have the statistical power to answer that question in a compelling way. So, basically the point is social corrections have the potential to backfire. And as sort of next directions in that work, we want to try and figure out, there's a lot of ways that this sort of direct correction differed from our earlier accuracy nudge stuff. It was public rather than private. It was delivered by a sort of apparently person rather than a bot. It was a direct confrontation about something that they themselves posted rather than a sort of neutral third party, here's a random headline. And so we want to sort of unpack all of that to figure out what's the sort of landscape of when you get positive effects and when you get negative effects. Yeah, so from this, was it a question about does the focal correction produce the kind of effects like repeating it or focusing attention on an idea? Well, yeah, so there's two different, in terms of the backfire literature on corrections, there's the sort of worldview backfire idea, which is what I was talking about before, that if you get corrected, it makes you dig in and engage in motivated reasoning and sort of really believe what you're saying. And then there's the familiarity backfire effect, which I think more along the lines of what the question is asking about, where when you correct something, if you're repeating the falsehood in the process of correcting it, that can actually wind up backfiring because just hearing things repeated makes them believe it more. And there is also reasonable evidence that that doesn't really happen that much. It's a bit more tenuous. I think the jury is a little bit still out on the familiarity backfire, but I think it seems like much less of a problem than you might have thought it was. And we can find effective corrections, when you look, that is, corrections tend to fade over time, but not usually entirely. And yeah, so a question about would a private correction versus a private nudge work equally? As I'm saying, it's a great question that we like. That's sort of the next step in a lot of this, is try and figure out amongst all of these different dimensions, what is it that matters and what is it that doesn't. And then another person asks about the sort of, I think, the mechanism. Yes, like, is it, I'm sorry, I'm just forcing people to get out of their own moral wiggle room. Yeah, right. So as part of the sharing about moral wiggle room, I'm like, well, I want to share this. I know it's probably not true, but I have some kind of plausible deniability or whatever, and this eliminates that. That could definitely be part of it. I think another sort of important direction for this stuff is to essentially sort out why it is that people don't want to share inaccurate information. And like sort of exactly what is going into the attentional element of it. Now, so in terms of gaming the system, there's a concern of, oh, if people know that the reason I'm getting asked these accuracy nudges is to try and make me more discerning in my sharing. I think that is an issue with a lot of sort of nudge type interventions, as once you know about it, it doesn't work anymore. But I actually don't see any reason to expect that to be true for this intervention, because what it's trying to do, it's not trying to trick people into doing something they don't want to do. Like, our research suggests that most people do actually really want to be accurate in their sharing. And so this is sort of helping them do something that they should want to do in the first place. And also knowing that it's trying to get you to think about accuracy is itself an accuracy nudge, because that gets you to think about accuracy. And so the concern would be, is there going to be some kind of reactance? And so, that's something that we'll have to test, but I'm reasonably hopeful that that won't be true. And I also think that the inclination to game things is quite overstated, because it's sort of built on the idea that there are tons of extreme partisans out there who like are really invested in their partisan identities. But most of the work in political science suggests that like most people really don't care very much about politics. And it's just that the people that are very vocal are the people that care, and so you sort of have an overestimate of the extent to which people are really invested in politics. Basically, if the idea is you have these pop-ups occasionally, or in feed cards asking people to judge the accuracy of headlines, like I was saying, you could just ignore the answers that people give, and this would still be a useful intervention, because it would nudge people to think about accuracy. But it also raises the question of, well, should you actually throw out the answers, or might the answers actually really be useful? And in particular, the reason you might expect them to be useful, or the way that they could be useful, relates to the problem that I raised earlier in the talk about the scalability problems of fact-checking. So if platforms were able to identify inaccurate or false headlines, that would be really useful, because either they could downrank them or they could put warnings on labels on them. But the problem with professional fact-checking is it just is really slow and it doesn't scale. And so the question is, can we use crowdsourcing in this sort of way, where you essentially are administering polls to users? Can you use fact-checking? Sorry, can you use crowdsourcing to help make fact-checking scalable? It would be great, because it's easy to get millions of lay people to give opinions, and cheap. But there's a lot of reasons to be worried that the layperson judgments would not actually be very accurate. For example, that lay people just don't know, don't have the background knowledge or training to identify veracity, or that people would try and game the system and sort of say that they think content that's aligned with their ideology is accurate even when it's not, because they want it to be on the platform. What we did is we ran various different studies looking into the extent to which fact-checking can help crowdsourcing can help fact-checking scale. Now, the place that we started with this was looking at rating of publishers rather than individual articles. This was motivated by the fact that Facebook announced that they, a couple of years ago, that they were going to start surveying users about how much they trusted different outlets and then upranking content from outlets that were broadly trusted. And everybody freaked out and thought this was a terrible idea. A journalist called me and asked what I thought, and I said, yeah, it sounds like a terrible idea. And then I was like, oh, wait, actually, that's a simple empirical question. Why don't we just run an experiment to find out? So we took a set of 60 publishers. It's the same set that I talked about before that has this fact checker ratings associated with it. And we asked about 1,000 Americans sort of quota sample to be representative on age, gender, ethnicity, and geographic region, how much they trusted each of these different news sources. And I'm going to show you one dot per source with the trust among Democrats on the x-axis and trust among Republicans on the y-axis. And so what you see is there are some partisan differences, like the Republicans trust Fox way more than they trust anything else. And the Democrats trust literally every other mainstream outlet more than the Republicans do. But these are kind of second order differences. And if you collapse everything down to the diagonal, that is, if you create a politically balanced layperson rating, equally weighting the Republicans and the Democrats, every single mainstream site does better than every single hyperpartisan or fake news site. And that's because, although the Republicans do trust Fox more than the other mainstream sites, they on average trust CNN and New York Times more than they trust Breitbart or InfoWars. And similarly, although the Democrats trust Fox less than, Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, they trust it more than left-leaning hyperpartisan sites like Daily Kos or Common Dreams. And so if you compare the sort of politically balanced laypeople ratings with the fact-checker ratings, they correlate at 0.9, which is the highest correlation I've ever observed in anything I've run in my life. And it's driven by the fact that both that Democrats, Republicans, and fact-checkers all give the hyperpartisan and fake news sites very low trust scores. There's much less agreement amongst the mainstream sites. So they have less agreement on what's good, but everybody agrees on what's not good. And so this seems really promising, but this sort of publisher-based approach has some serious limitations. The first one is that basically source level ratings are often too coarse because publishers have a whole range of different content. Like Breitbart, for example, about 1/3 of the content on Breitbart is just straight reposts of Reuters articles. So really you want something that's more fine-grained than just the outlet. And also we found that familiarity played a really big role in people's trust judgments, that essentially nobody trusted outlets that they had never heard of. And so if you use these trust scores at the outlet level, that will punish either new sources or niche sources that are actually trustworthy. It's just that people don't know about them. So what we wanted to know, if we want to think about crowds as sort of scaling fact-checking, is can this work when you look at individual articles? And so we did this in a sort of interesting model of collaboration with Facebook, where we got a grant from the Hewlett Foundation to work with Facebook on helping them sort of figure out how to do fact-checking. So we got a set of headlines from them that their internal algorithm flagged as potentially problematic and things they would want fact-checked. We hired 3 fact-checkers to research each article and assess its accuracy. And then we also got about 1,000 Americans from Amazon Mechanical Turk. We showed them just the headline and the lead, and we had them rate the accuracy based on a sort of gut judgment just from the headline and the lead. And the idea is researching each article takes a long time, and so can the wisdom of crowds allow lay people just working with the headline to do a reasonable job of approximating what you get out of fact-checker research? And what I'm going to show you here is the correlation between the average layperson rating based on the headline and the average fact-checker rating based on research. So 1 would be perfect agreement, 0 would be total disagreement, you know, or sorry, 1 would be perfect agreement, 0 would be just noise, like no signal at all. And so, you know, and we're going to look at the correlation between the lay people and the fact checkers as a function of the size of the crowd. That is how many lay people we were having rate each article or headline. And we also wanted to see whether providing information about the source, was the publisher, that is, was helpful because it's more information, or was harmful because it might sort of activate more partisan, you know, inclinations. So, okay, we want to look at these correlations, but the problem is, how do you judge what counts as a good correlation? And to create some kind of benchmark, or essentially like a ceiling on what you might expect to be the performance, what we looked at was how correlated the fact checker ratings were with each other, because the 3 fact checkers were not in perfect agreement. And in fact, there was actually a reasonable amount of disagreement between them, and their ratings correlated with each other at about 0.62. So there clearly is a lot of signal there. I'm not saying there's no truth and it's, you know, whatever postmodern, you know, hellscape, but basically truth is complicated, and so it's hard, you know, to get super precise ratings of it. And so that's actually one other issue with fact checker programs that comes out of this, is you don't want to be relying on the judgment of one person, even if they're a professional fact checker. Okay, so we want to know how well does the crowd do. And here, what you see is that with only about 10 lay people if they have source info, and maybe about 20 lay people without source info, so, you know, with the better design, 10 lay people just reading the headline and the lead produce ratings that are as correlated with the fact checkers' research results as the fact checkers are with each other. So we think that this suggests that there's really a lot of promise for crowdsourcing helping fact checking scale. And again, just to emphasize, a really important part of this this work is that we're using the actual sets of actually sort of ecologically valid, relevant sets of headlines that the platforms are actually wanting classified, not just some ones that we picked, because we could obviously make the task very easy or hard if we sort of cherry-picked headlines in one way or another. Okay, so to wrap this up, relying on just machine learning classifiers and then professional fact-checking is not going to be enough to sort of get a handle on the misinformation problem. And our work suggests that lay people are actually surprisingly good at telling information quality if they bother to pay attention. And so that means that making accuracy salient, sort of priming the concept of accuracy, making it top of mind for people, leads them to be more discerning in what they choose to share. And that using crowdsourcing can help identify low quality sites and articles. And actually, one other point on the crowdsourcing is just we did another experiment where we told people that their responses would be shared with Facebook to help inform the ranking algorithms, which you might think would induce people to game the algorithm. And we didn't find any evidence of that. People got a little bit more polarized in their ratings, but it didn't reduce the sort of fidelity of the crowdsourcing at all. And so what this means is that these are both scalable tools that don't rely on centralized authority, but rather take advantage of people's own sort of cognitive abilities that I think it would be really useful for social media platforms to add to their sort of anti-misinformation toolkit. The one major caveat that I want to give is that you know, misinformation is a global problem, and it's really important to assess how well all of this stuff generalizes cross-culturally before platforms would try and implement any of these things in a sort of global way. As I said, we're beginning to get some evidence of cross-cultural replication for the accuracy salience work, but I think it's a really important future direction for all of this. It's also really important in the context of crowdsourcing because a major worry about crowdsourcing that our work has not addressed so far is that in countries where there's a big sort of majority-minority split, then that's sort of asymmetric, then crowdsourcing may potentially allow majority groups to either silence minority groups or sort of promote falsehoods about the minority groups. And so figuring out some way of sort of dealing with those basically fairness concerns within the context of crowdsourcing is an important future direction for that work as well. Okay, so thanks everybody for your attention. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this. Gord Pennycook at University of Regina is my sort of teammate in all things misinformation. And then these are a bunch of other folks at MIT who drove a lot of this work. And these also thanks to our funders and thanks to you guys. So now I'd love to answer any additional questions. I see a couple have popped up here. So.
Dave, thank you so much. That was really amazing, thorough. I've read pretty much all of these papers now, and I can vouch for how rigorous and solid this research is. It's so necessary. Moving past the, how does fake news work into what do we do about it is clearly the next step. And I don't really know anyone on the planet besides you and Gord and your team that are this far ahead on large-scale experimental evidence of how do we fight fake news. I have a quick question, and then I'll turn it over to a few. I will curate some of these questions, or if you see some that you think are burning in the chat that you want to point out, I'd be happy to let you do that as well. So one thing that you mentioned is that the nuance to this is so important. A lot of the results contradict each other in a non-intellectual contradiction way, but in a way where you can actually create a solution. So for example, you want to labeling works, but if you don't label anything, if you don't label everything, then things that aren't labeled users assume that they're true because they're not labeled, right? So this is the implied truth effect that you guys wrote about. Backfiring, there is no backfiring on beliefs, so corrections work for beliefs, but there seems to be a backfiring on sharing, right? And some of the questions about private versus public, et cetera, can you talk just for a minute about how nuanced the responses have to be so that we can, tailor the edges of them to be right with that result and also include that result. And, it's got to be a very specific set of interventions to work in a way that avoids the good, that avoids the bad and harnesses the good of this, right?
Totally. And so I think that one part of it is, as you're saying, things are really nuanced. And so it's important that if people are going to try to implement an intervention, they really are very well versed in this literature, or that they are sort of partnering with academics who spend all their time thinking about this stuff. But I think the other huge component of it is there's still a ton that we don't know. And so I think it's, we can't say oh, well, if you read all the papers, then you will know the exact right way to do it. But rather, the point is it is tricky. And so it's totally essential that if a platform is thinking about implementing any kind of intervention, A, they pilot it, and B, they look not just at the effect on the thing where they apply the intervention, but I feel like a lot of the point of this is you need to think broadly about what are all of the potential consequences or side effects that this intervention might have, and try and measure all of those things and be what effect does it have on the content you're intervening on? What effects does it have on the content you're not intervening on? What effects does it have on subsequent sharing? All of these different dimensions. If you want to get it right, it's really important to do that. And I think one of the issues, which actually I think came up a little bit in the chat, is that it's not super clear that the platforms really have an incentive to do it right versus an incentive to do something and then say, hey, we did something.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that. There was a good question in the chat about, do they have any incentive? I wanted to get your opinion on that. And then another one was, does the labeling solution susceptible to bots? In other words, can bots go through and mess that solution up?
Totally. So on the do they have an incentive question? I mean, So first of all, I think an issue is that a tech company is not a monolithic. It's not one thing. It's made up of lots of people. Although there's a few people at the top that have most of the power, and so I think that from a pure incentives perspective, the incentive that they have is all about PR, and it's just for people to stop saying that they're bad and to avoid regulation. But I also, and my sense is that people at the top don't really care past that. But I think that they're all a lot of the people that are the actual sort of on the ground foot soldier people working in the misinformation units that really care very deeply about this in an actual kind of ethical way and like want to do it right. And so I feel like there's some sort of internal tension there. And then, yes, in terms of gaming things, a key is just sort of very simply solved by having the crowdsourcing be like polling rather than like Reddit. So if you have a thing where just any user can come and vote on any piece of content that they want, that's extremely easily gamed, astroturfed, and so on. But if instead the way it works is random users get picked and offered the opportunity to give their opinion about a piece of content, then you can't sort of do a coordinated attack on that because you don't have a way of being selected to give your opinion. And actually the way Facebook is planning on doing this is even more protected against that, which is they're not actually surveying users, like active users on platform. They're just hiring lay people, essentially as in a similar model to content moderators. They just hire lay people who spend 20 hours a week looking at articles and giving their opinion. And so it still costs them a little bit of money, but it's way cheaper than professional fact checkers. And so that's a way you can really insulate this from that kind of attack.
Awesome. So, okay. Really, really a pleasure to have you, Dave. We have come to the end of our time. It was fantastic and great to see all of you virtually and to have this great discussion, great questions. So just as a reminder, we have another fantastic speaker next week, Sharad Goyal from Stanford Management Science and Engineering. He's been doing such great work on algorithmic bias and criminal justice algorithms and criminal justice and so on. And so he's going to give a talk which is titled Designing Equitable Algorithms for Criminal Justice and Beyond. He's fantastic. So I highly recommend seeing you all again next week.